go. Yeah, you love my butter. I stop, you body color. I don't talk, no, no.